You are listening to CEO Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.
Welcome to this episode of CEO Perspectives, a signature series by the Conference Board. CEO Perspectives are conversations that take an objective, nonpartisan look at a range of subjects that matter most to business leaders. To help make sense of these topics, we sit down with thought leaders and do what we do best at the Conference Board, provide trusted insights for what's ahead. I'm Steve Odland from the Conference Board and the host of this series, and in today's conversation, we're going to talk about Gen Z. Gen Z workers are expected to represent nearly a third of the workforce in just a couple of years, and as U.S. job openings continue to reach historic highs, businesses urgently need this generation in their workforce. But how can businesses attract and hold on to these workers? Because they are different. What makes them different from other generations? We're going to talk today about with Robin Erickson, who is the Vice President of Human Capital here at the Conference Board. Robin, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
Okay, so we got to start with, what the heck is Gen Z?
Well, funny you should ask that, because there actually is some disagreement about when Generation Z starts. And there are multiple years that people use to indicate Gen Z. But the Bureau of Labor Statistics defines Gen Z as those people who were born in 1997 or later. And that makes the oldest Gen Zer, or Zoomer as they like to be called, just 26 years old today.
Wow. Well, there is a new generation after Gen Z, which I've heard has been christened Generation Alpha, which is 2010. You know, this whole generation thing, it's interesting. The greatest generation started in the early part of the 20th century. Of course, they're the ones that started it, so they named themselves the greatest generation. It's always interesting to be the namer of these things. But then you had the traditionalists and the baby boomers, Gen X, Gen Y, Gen Z, and then Gen Alpha.
Well, it shows you how we're not getting very creative, and I'm just happy it's not Generation Alpha like it would be in Excel.
Well, but it is interesting that it's the greatest generation who started all this and named everybody, which is I guess that's par for the course. But anyway, okay, so Gen Z is really the newest workforce generation, if we think about it that way, and so very important generation. You recently did a report on Gen Z workers, what motivates them and so forth. How did you study them?
Well, we know there's a lot being written about Gen Z. All you have to do is open up your news feed, pick the one you like. But our study was distinctive because it focused on communicating directly with over 100 Gen Z employees, full-time workers, and by addressing both hourly and knowledge workers. We had a 40-60 split, and 40% hourly workers and 60% knowledge workers. And trust me, it was much easier to find knowledge workers to connect with. But we also sought the views of CHROs about this generation.
Yeah, and it is interesting. It's just so nice to be talking about Gen Z, because we've been talking about millennials for what, almost a generation?
At least 10 years.
Yeah. Seems like, okay, so why is it so important that employers focus on this newest generation in the workforce?
Well, the first is, as you said, Gen Zers are going to represent over 30% of the workforce in just a couple of years, and so they're plentiful. Despite the global economic showdown, our 2023 C-Suite Outlook reports that attracting and retaining talent is still the number one internal issue of C-Suite executives. And so it's really important that employers think about Gen Z when they are trying to fill empty positions. But I have even better news than that, even better than they're plentiful, I think. We all know that Gen Zers are technologically savvy because we've all asked them to help us with our devices or our computers or our soundboards or our modems or our routers. But because they're used to continually evolving technology platforms, they're not change resistant. And so when organizations are thinking about trying to find change adopters, right? That's actually a term in change management, to find your champions, your change champions, and the people who would be early adopters. Gen Z are really terrific at being interested in doing that.
Yeah, and they're entering the workforce. So whenever you and I have been doing this for a long time, and we've seen multiple generations enter the workforce, mature in the workforce, and so forth. From your experience, how much of what we are experiencing with Gen Z is unique to the generation, and how much of it is just that this is what the newest generation is usually like in the workforce.
So I actually think that Gen Z is different than other workforces at this stage of their career. When you and I first got our job, it might have been through a newspaper posting. And today, that's not how people find jobs. They find it through job boards and online. But Gen Zers are the first truly digital natives. So what does that mean? It means they've grown up completely within the digital era. They have no memory of a time without smartphones, apps, search engines, laptops, or online global connections. They know how to connect with each other. They've actually become the influencer generation, and so they have a
Yeah,
voice.
but do they know how to use an abacus in a slide rule? I mean, that's this is the thing.
They probably don't know how to use the slide rule, but it's really interesting. I think they are much faster at learning how to learn and finding out information. Anyway, I think that Gen Z is truly different. They are the most diverse generation that we've had. In fact, they are less than half white for the first time in the US, that we have a generation that's less than half white. And I think that, we need to be aware that Gen Z is approaching work and life in a different way, in part because they've just gotten through a really tumultuous time, right? With 3 years of the COVID pandemic, we've got global unrest and economic issues. I think Gen Z's they're at a really interesting stage that perhaps other generations that we aren't as familiar with haven't gone through.
I mean, this is a really important point because they're a product of what they've experienced so far, and what they've experienced so far has been all these black swan events, which are sort of one in a lifetime, unpredictable, weird events. But that's been their entire career so far. So the whole thing's been weird for them.
Well, and most of them have finished their education. Think about it. If the oldest is 26, most of them finished their educations under lockdowns or having to be remote. So I definitely think that this is a different generation. And we found that in our study.
Yeah, and generations, of course, anytime that you're trying to summarize a generation or generalize, it's wrong. But there are some characteristics that you pointed out, and there's a shared experience here, which makes the generation different because every generation has a different shared experience, I guess, right?
Definitely.
Yeah.
Even those of us in Generation X, who are the smallest generation out there.
Yeah, that's it's interesting, but it does say though that business leaders, managers, HR people, I mean, you need to understand what the generation has experienced in order to then relate to them, but also though to engage them and to help them in the workforce. Talk about that challenge.
So I definitely think that employers should be concerned about Gen Z and look at what motivates them and influences them, especially because when it comes to retaining Gen Zers, the Gen Zers are willing to job hop. We have to also remember that in addition to all of those black swan events you mentioned, they've also been, many of them, or most of them, have been working during a time of great labor shortages, right? We had the Great Resignation. We still have labor shortages today, despite increasing inflation and economic uncertainty. But Gen Zers have very high expectations for the workplace and for where they want to work, and they'll seek new opportunities. They don't think it's a stigma to job hop. And so they want their employers to provide growth and development, and they're skeptical of organizations that have statements of values and missions without any action behind them. And we can't forget that switching jobs is really easy for many workers right now because there's a lot of open positions, but it's also very easy to put your resume out there and send out, 20 resumes in an hour if you want to. Like that is another difference too, of this generation and what they expect.
Well, and there's so much remote and hybrid work that it doesn't require a move across the country or across the city. They can do it from where they are, switch jobs, make more money. So the whole thing is much more fluid than it used to be.
Oh, that's definitely true. I mean, we found that wanting flexibility was definitely one of the highlights of our study. I mean, one of the things that Gen Zers themselves say that they have to have.
But you know what, in my discussions with many of our Gen Z workers, they say, I've got to move because that's how I build skill sets and experiences, and that's how I learn. And that's not the way previous generations thought about, career development. It wasn't that you had to learn by moving companies. It was that you had different experiences within a company. Talk about that.
I think that many companies, we all know that once upon a time, the pendulum has shifted. Once upon a time, it was all in-person learning. And you remember that when it was all in-class learning and we would go to classes together and sit there. And then the pendulum switched in organizations, went all the way to the other direction to all online learning. And then I think our learning and development folks realized there wasn't as much ROI there. But the issue is that many organizations haven't made their career paths clear. So Gen Zers don't see a path forward in terms of new skills. They also want to be promoted quickly. They also want to move quickly. They think they've mastered something and want to move on. And I think in the past, there was more of an expectation that employees would, quote unquote, put their time in or spend longer at a job than I think Gen Zers are willing to do.
Yeah, and there clearly is value to going through a few cycles, and sitting through that, and you learn something in each case. But so there's some of it that is just, this is just what the generation expects. Some of it is just that they live in social media. They've got perfect communication, real time, and so it's just like this is what you're supposed to do. It doesn't make it right or wrong, but it is a challenge for businesses to think through that. And as you said, it's a communication challenge, but it's also a reality challenge in trying to build experiences, right?
Definitely. And I think that it also underscores the need for internal mobility or talent mobility, which is organizations focusing on, rather than bringing in new employees, they should be focusing on reskilling their employees, on teaching them how to learn new skills as the world evolves.
Yeah, and it means being deliberate about it, because in the olden days, in the old world, it was a very hierarchical organization modeled after the military, and there were a lot of steps in there. And in today's flatter world and so forth, you have to be, as an employer and as business leaders, we need to be more deliberate about saying, we got to recognize people, and part of recognition is title, part of recognition is different experiences. And so, you can either sit and rail against that as the attitude, or you can say, well, let's adapt to that. And it seems to me that adapting is the more important attribute.
Especially if you're trying to retain employees. But let me tell you, it's also really effective when you're trying to attract employees. If they hear that they have career paths that are laid out with skill development along the way, I think candidates will be more interested in joining.
Yeah, in all of our human capital studies too, and especially the studies that focus on engagement, it's about how people feel, right? And whether they think that employers care about them, and that comes back down not to, there isn't a company caring person, it's their direct supervision. And so we really have to spend time teaching managers who may not have grown up in this kind of mindset, but teaching them to be empathetic and demonstrating, not just saying, but demonstrating that they care.
Could not agree more. And I think we should write a report about that.
It feels like we have. So now let's come back after a short break and talk about what we do about it and what are the responsibilities of Gen Z. We're going to take a short break and we'll be right back.
What does the future of work mean for your employees? How will your company navigate ESG? Will there be a global recession? At the Conference Board, our experts translate the latest research and economic analysis into insights and real-time problem solving for your organization. Membership at the Conference Board provides your team with an assortment of knowledge, from economics, marketing and communications, ESG, public policy, and human capital. As a member, you'll have access to our center experts, member-exclusive events, data and benchmarking tools, and peer sharing that will help you understand the present and shape the future. Consider becoming a Conference Board member today by visiting www.conference-board.org.
Welcome back to CEO Perspectives. I'm your host, Steve Odland from the Conference Board, and I'm joined today by Robin Erickson from the Human Capital Center here at the Conference Board, and we're talking about Gen Z. Let's go back to your study, because this new study that you've just come out with is very interesting. You talked about 5 things that are essential. Maybe you could summarize that for us.
Sure. Well, the number one thing that was most important for Gen Z employees was that many are concerned about their ability to afford the basic necessities and worry that they won't be able to afford to buy a house. And so they are very concerned about compensation and pay transparency. The fact that they also share salaries freely among themselves in person and online. It's very easy to go online and find reviews of organizations and salaries. So, you also know that one of the trends with Gen Z is that many are living at home. And in many places, or for many of them, it's to save money. And then many of them are also looking for new jobs that provide more financial security for them. So I think that goes back to my point earlier about Gen Zers being willing to job hop. I think right now organizations are having a hard time because with job shortages, it's very difficult to continue to pay new employees more unless you're going to go back and pay your old employees at the same level.
Yeah, and this pay transparency thing, of course, is the law in most areas now too. The benefits, of course, are that it provides job seekers and those who hold the same jobs in a company. It provides hopefully more understanding and theoretically more fairness. There is a flip side to it though too, and that is that by doing that, you have to provide a big enough range, because there are people who have greater skill sets and greater experience who therefore demand and I don't want to use the term deserve, but have higher levels of pay. And then there are people on whom you take risks in a company that may not have the experience or the skill sets, but you don't value them the same. And so there needs to be, I guess it needs to be a shared understanding that there is a range, there's a reason for the range, and that range is okay.
I think the range is important, but I also think that it's important to make sure that it's equitable across new employees and existing employees.
Yeah. Now, the generation also wants more flexibility. And part of that is, again, as you said earlier, based on the experience that they've had so far coming up through the pandemic and going to 100% remote, in their minds, they've proven that can work. And so why would you have to do anything else? But what they don't know is what they're missing from, an in-office or a more social environment with all the, the informal learning and mentoring and all those types of things. How should employers and leaders make that point? And, how do you engage this group to understand the benefits of at least some interaction?
Well, I think the good news is that most Gen Zers that we spoke to actually do want some in-person interaction. And I think that it just needs to be planned or structured in such a way that people don't go into the office where there's no one there. And then say, well, there's no reason to go in, right? Or they go into the office and then they're on Zoom calls all day. And so they have to be, shut up. So I think that it's important to think of the office as, the new offsite in terms of when people are coming in, what are you providing? What's the, what are the, I don't want to say incentives, but how are you going to keep them from having to be on calls all day? And one of the things I've done with my team of Gen Zers is to request that they're all in the office on the same day every week, at least one day that they're all there together, and that they are co-locating to learn from each other, to work together and to learn from each other.
Yeah, no, it has to be planned. It can't just be left to random. Yogi Berra used to have a saying that, that place is too crowded, so nobody goes there anymore. But it's, it's almost the reverse with the office now. Nobody's there, so nobody wants to come. And, it needs to be so you can't just leave it to happenstance. It's your point. You have to.
Right. And I'm not trying to say it has to be fun all the time. I'm just saying it has to be planned and structured and some thought to go into it. And it's interesting because there was no thought about remote work before COVID hit. If you think about it, back to March of 2020, no one had stepped back and said, what would happen if a pandemic came through and we all had to go to our homes and never leave?
Well, that'll never happen. That's a black swan event. It'll never happen. And yeah.
Exactly. We don't have to spend any time thinking about it. But now the reverse is true. Now we do need to think about how are we going to make the most of our offices.
But it's so much of it's now hybrid, and I think that's we've written about that at the conference board, that hybrid is probably here to stay in some balance. But it doesn't mean, it means that we need to be more deliberate about planning what work is done remotely and what work is done together, because you can't, when you come to the office and you're just sitting on, as you said, on Zoom meetings, or doing what you're behaving in a remote fashion in the office, or you're trying to do sole contributor kind of work. You're trying to write a report, or you're trying to get something done, and people keep interrupting you. That doesn't work. On the other hand, it's hard to socialize when you're sitting at home, staring at a computer. So it really calls for more of a, I don't know, this is oversimplification, but a bifurcation of work and a deliberate planning of what goes on when you're remote and what goes on when you're together. And this is a challenge for leaders.
I think, especially for managers, I think that we need to make sure that our managers know how to help their teams plan for these types of interactions. What work happens remotely and what work happens in the office. I think we need to be asking our managers to plan for that.
We've been talking a lot about, in office, and that's only one aspect of the workforce, because, really it's a minority of the workforce that works in the office. But you did talk to hourly workers who are out there doing non-office kind of work. How did you hear, what did you hear from the hourly workers that was different?
So the imperative that we found from the Gen Zers in general was to give them more control. And for the knowledge workers, it was flexibility, which we've just been talking about. But for the hourly workers, it meant having some say in the shifts that were assigned to them and knowing that their shifts well in advance so they could plan for personal commitments. Because what's been happening is, with the labor shortages, many hourly workers are being expected to drop everything and take on additional shifts, or they're being told their schedule just a couple days in advance. And so it's really hard to have a life. It's hard to plan. And so we found that really they want some more control about when they work.
It's very interesting. It comes back to this, we said it so many times, the manager training and being, and so it feels to me like, the senior leadership of these companies need to think through how to teach the managers to engage differently based on the needs and the differences in today's world, and to do things differently than we did it, call it pre-pandemic, right? I mean, so that's a big change.
It is a big change, and it's a lot of responsibility. And we're finding that, as you've done podcasts with Rebecca Ray on burnout, there's increasing burnout, both with employees and with leaders. So I think we need to get smart quickly about how can we try to help our managers deal with some of these things so that there's less burnout.
Yeah, and the whole burnout thing is as you said, it's a whole fascinating subject, because it's people trying to work remotely and trying to balance life and work, whereas before they were in separate places and you could separate them. Now it kind of mushes together and they can't get away from either one of them ever. And it's driving people nuts. So it comes back to helping people, training and helping people say it's okay to park. You get not only it's okay, it's required that you park the work and you don't do it and you don't look at it, 24/7, and that you create that separation on your own that used to be physical. But
it's also these little devices that I'm holding up, this little smartphone, because you can do work 24/7 on vacation, on the weekends. And I think that it's not just the issues of remote versus, not having a distinction between work and life. I think it's also just that the technology has made working 24/7 possible.
So what's your advice to managers and higher level leaders in terms of how to drive engagement with Gen Z workers?
Oh, very, very interesting. Few things. One of the other imperatives that we found was around the concerns that Gen Zers have around staying safe and well. It's not surprising given everything they've been through with COVID and all those other Black Swan events we were talking about. They're very concerned about mental health. And in fact, sadly, I have a statistic here that almost half of Gen Zers are reporting that they are anxious or depressed all the time. And so, they're very aware of that.
That is really depressing.
Well, it is. But, the other issue is that emotional coping maturity, I'm sure that's not the correct psychological term for it, but with age comes the ability to cope, right? With more maturity. And so these are really young people who, haven't had that opportunity.
And it's real.
It's real.
Yeah, this is the important point. I think for older workers, it's like, well, snowflakes, you get these people, yada yada. It's real for them. So therefore, if it's real for them, then it's incumbent upon leaders to deal with that reality. Whether or not you agree with it or experience it, you have to be empathetic, because if you're going to engage those people, you have to deal with what's real for them. Yeah.
Right. Well, and think about it. If almost half of your employees, or at least half of your Gen Z employees are anxious or depressed, you're not going to get the best out of them for their work either. So that's one thing that I think it's one way that organizations can help engage Gen Zers. I think Gen Zers are also really interested in wanting to have opportunities to grow. And we talked about this earlier in terms of how do you keep a Gen Zer engaged? Well, if they think that they can grow, that's another reason that they would stay, right? And to be motivated.
So a lot of this, you may disagree, but as I think about it, a lot of this comes down to basic communication. It comes down to communication from the top in terms of what's the mission of the organization, walking that talk. It comes down to communication and training. Human capital experts call it upskilling, training. However, the point is you have to enable your leaders and your managers to deal with this. And then there's the communication training of the Gen Zers themselves to provide some context and help them understand and grow. I mean, is that an oversimplification, Robin?
I don't think it is, especially because you touched on our fifth imperative for Gen Zers, which was that they care about purpose and values. And it's they can see, right? I mean, we're all getting pretty good at figuring out who's phishing us, right? Or who's spamming us. And, we know if messages are written from the heart, if they're real. And so I think that, many of the Gen Zers we spoke to said that they would leave a job if their values didn't align with those of their employer. And that's interesting. That was not the case when you and I first started working, Steve.
Yeah, it was more monolithic at that point.
It was very monolithic, and you would never question the authority, right?
Final thoughts, Robin?
As I said earlier, I think one of the most exciting things about Gen Z is that they're not resistant to change. And so I think that trying to attract and retain them, I think it comes down to figuring out what motivates them, what incents them. And I think our report does just that. And I'm hoping we'll find is very useful for organizations as they're trying to think about how can they fill some of their talent gaps.
Yeah, with all the dangers of generalization and realizing that everybody's different within every generation.
Exactly. And the thing is that when you do offer programs, you can't just offer them to the Gen Zers. I mean, in our report, we talk about what different organizations are doing, with some of their programs that are attractive to Gen Z, but they're not just offering those to the Gen Z employees, because you can't do that. You have to offer them to all of your employees and assume that what's good for Gen Z is going to be good for the other generations as well.
Great points. Robin Erickson, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
And thanks to all of you for listening into CEO Perspectives. Every week, I'll be joined by a prominent thought leader to provide insights on the issues of our time. We'll cover leading topics in human capital, geopolitics, economics, and more. Please share CEO Perspectives with your colleagues, including all of your Gen Z colleagues, because I know they're going to want to listen. I'm Steve Odland, and this podcast has been brought to you by the Conference Board.
You have been listening to CEO Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.